When the world stands on the edge of collapse, two rivals must join forces to stop it. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Can they put aside their past and save us all, or will their distrust destroy everything? Kamala Harris sat at her desk, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a coffee cup. The soft buzz of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in her otherwise silent office. Her mind was a swirl of thoughts: global tensions, national security, domestic issues, and the looming summit in Geneva. The world felt like it was on the edge of a precipice, and she was standing right at the edge, trying to prevent the fall. She glanced down at the briefing papers in front of her, her eyes scanning the urgent reports that had arrived just hours earlier. The situation was escalating. Nuclear talks were faltering. Tensions with Russia and China were higher than they'd been in decades. The stakes couldn't be more critical. Kamala rubbed her temples, her thoughts racing. The summit would be the most important moment of her career, a chance to make a difference in the most high-stakes situation imaginable. But then came the last piece of the puzzle, and the thing that she hadn't been prepared for: her co-delegate. The name that stood out like a flashing red light, something she wasn't sure she could work with, let alone trust. "Madam Vice President, you need to see this." "Marcus," her chief of staff said, his voice tight as he entered the room, holding a tablet in his hands. His expression was one Kamala had come to know well, concern mixed with urgency. Kamala didn't even look up from the papers. "What is it, Marcus?" Her voice was strained, already bracing herself for bad news. He didn't reply immediately, but slid the tablet onto her desk, the screen illuminating his worried face. Kamala read the subject line first. Kamala Harris, U.S. Lead Delegate. Summit in Geneva. Urgent response required. Her heart skipped a beat. Geneva, the summit that had the potential to either save the world or push it toward the brink of disaster. She looked up sharply, the weight of the moment hitting her. "Get me up to speed, Marcus," she said, her voice now firm. She was ready to face whatever challenge was coming her way. He hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was serious, careful. There's more. The U.S. delegation, they want you to co-lead, but, Kamala's patience was wearing thin. Your co-delegate is Donald Trump," Marcus finished, his voice almost apologetic. Kamala's breath caught in her throat. Donald Trump, the man who had spent years undermining her, the man who had repeatedly attacked her policies, her character, her qualifications. The thought of working with him now, especially on something so critical, felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. But the weight of the decision was clear. She couldn't back down. "Are you serious?" Kamala said, her voice sharp, her disbelief obvious. Marcus nodded. "It's true. He has the experience. He knows how to play the global game. It's why they chose him." Kamala leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She knew Marcus was right. Trump had experience, though it was often in the form of bombast and controversy, not diplomacy. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the pressure mount. "I can't believe this," she muttered. "This is not how I imagine saving the world." "Fine. Get the flight booked. I'm going." Mar-a-Lago, Florida. Meanwhile, on the pristine greens of his private golf course, Donald Trump stood with his driver, eyeing the ball as he prepared for his next shot. A perfect, sunny afternoon. Everything felt controlled. Even in the midst of the mounting global tensions, Trump could retreat to this space and momentarily forget about the mess in the world. That is, until his assistant, Derek, approached with a look that made him put his club down and turn his attention. "Mr. Trump," Derek said, a note of urgency creeping into his tone. "We've got a situation. Geneva, the summit. You've been called in. It's critical." Trump's face shifted only slightly, though his eyes narrowed as if he already knew what this was about. He'd seen the reports. He knew it was coming. "What's going on, Derek?" Trump asked, already turning to walk back toward the house. His voice was a mix of curiosity and frustration, as if the whole thing were an inconvenience. The Russians, the Chinese, things are spiraling, Derek explained, trying to keep pace. There's a nuclear risk, and the UN has requested your leadership. They want you to attend the summit as the lead US representative. Trump stopped in his tracks, a smirk forming on his face. The UN? They want me? Of course they do. Who else would they turn to when they need someone who knows how to make deals? All right, let's go. He turned back toward the course, grabbing his club. I'll finish this round, let them wait. I'll show up when I'm good and ready. Derek hesitated, but Trump waved him off. What's the real issue, Derek? You look worried. Derek took a deep breath. It's Kamala Harris. She's your co-delegate. Trump paused, the club lowering in his hands. Harris? You're kidding. This is a joke, right? Derek's face was serious. No joke. It's real. Trump shook his head, a mix of disbelief and amusement on his face. Unbelievable. She can't even run a country properly, and now she's running a summit? He laughed bitterly, tossing his club aside. Fine. Whatever. Let's see how this goes. Book the flight, Derek. Kamala arrived in Geneva late toward evening, her mind racing. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined, but as she stood on the tarmac, the chill of the Swiss air biting at her skin, she knew this was her moment. This wasn't about politics. It was about survival. The next morning they gathered in the conference room. World leaders were present, tense, their faces hard with concern. Kamala walked in first, confident, but feeling the weight of every eye on her. This was not the place for hesitation. And then a door opened, and there he was, Donald Trump. Kamala's stomach tightened. He walked in with the same swagger, his hands gesturing wildly as he entered the room. Trump's eyes immediately found hers. He gave her a quick nod. Kamala, he said, his voice flat but with that characteristic Trump tone. Here we are, saving the world. Kamala's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The last thing she wanted was to exchange pleasantries with him. She took her seat, keeping her focus sharp. They had no room for egos here. The others around the table, Russia, China, the UK, France, watched as Trump sat beside her. Kamala could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was watching to see how they would interact, how they would lead this summit. She wasn't sure if Trump was there to play politics or if he actually understood the gravity of the situation. All right, let's get started, Kamala said, her voice steady as she turned to the table. This isn't about politics. This is about the future of humanity. Trump leaned forward, his voice booming as he cut in. Exactly. But let's be clear. We're not here to make friends, we're here to win. And that means doing whatever it takes. Kamala's eyes met his. She could feel the chill of his words. He wasn't interested in diplomacy. He was interested in domination. This would not be easy. Sorry for interrupting you if you like this story, so don't forget to like Storyboat for more upcoming interesting stories. The conference room felt suffocating, like the air had thickened with the weight of responsibility. Kamala sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room. Every world leader was there, their expressions guarded, their nerves taut. There was no more room for politicking or grandstanding, not when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Beside her, Donald Trump shifted in his chair, his eyes flickering around the room, his hands clasped in front of him. He was calm, almost unnervingly so, as though this were just another business deal, another negotiation. Kamala's fingers curled into the table's edge, trying to focus, trying not to let his presence get under her skin. So, Kamala began, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence that had descended upon the room. We're all here because the threat of nuclear war is real. There's no time to waste. We need solutions, not more rhetoric. Trump turned toward her, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. You're right, Kamala. No time to waste. But I think you're forgetting something. This isn't just about talking it out. This is about showing strength. You want to save the world. You need to put pressure on these countries. Russia? They need to know we're not bluffing. Kamala stared at him, her jaw tightening. Not again. The way Trump saw the world, everything was about power and leverage. But she wasn't that person. She wasn't going to let him hijack this summit with his bravado. She cleared her throat, maintaining her composure. It's not about flexing muscles, Trump. It's about trust. It's about diplomacy. If we go in and demand everything without listening to them, we're going to alienate the very people we need to work with. Trump gave her a sidelong glance, his lips curling into that smug, familiar smile. Well, if you ask me, diplomacy doesn't work with guys like Ivanov and Joe. The Russians and the Chinese don't care about your nice talks and pleasantries. They'll take advantage of you every time. Kamala's patience was starting to wear thin, but she forced herself to stay calm. And that's where you're wrong. I've been negotiating with these leaders for years. I've seen firsthand how they respond to cooperation, not threats. The tension in the room was palpable. Kamala could feel the eyes of the other leaders on them, waiting for this strange pairing to either break apart or somehow find common ground. Just then Ivanov, the Russian president, stood up, his face a mask of cold indifference. Enough of this. You both talk like you're the ones who can save the world. But you can't even agree on how to speak to us. You Americans, always fighting among yourselves. We're ready to take action, whether you are or not. Kamala shot Trump a quick look, the frustration clear in her eyes. He met her gaze, and for a brief moment their unspoken understanding flickered. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about keeping the peace. She took a deep breath. Ivanov, I understand your concerns, but what we're asking for is a ceasefire, an agreement to halt all missile testing until we can come to the table with an official agreement. The alternative, full-scale military conflict. Ivanov laughed, a dry, rasping sound that sent a shiver down Kamala's spine. You think the West can stop us? You've lost your power. Russia will not be told what to do by anyone, least of all the United States. Trump leaned forward now, his voice rising almost like a challenge. You think you're tough, Ivanov? I've had more face-offs with your country than I can count. And let me tell you something. If you don't back down, it won't be the U.S. you'll have to answer to. It'll be your own people. Kamala's heart sank. Trump had just escalated the situation. She opened her mouth to intervene, but before she could speak, a loud bang echoed through the room. All heads turned as the doors burst open, and Joe, the Chinese representative, entered with a group of officials in tow. His face was unreadable, but Kamala could feel the weight of his presence. Sorry to interrupt the drama, Joe said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man used to being feared. But perhaps we should focus on the real issue. The world is watching, and we need results, not more empty words. His gaze lingered on Trump, then moved to Kamala. The U.S. has proven unreliable, and frankly, we have no faith in your leadership. If you want us to cooperate, you must show us that you are willing to make real concessions. Kamala felt a moment of frustration building inside her. How was she supposed to negotiate with people who wouldn't even meet her halfway? She turned to Trump. This is it, Trump. This is where your strength can backfire. If we push too hard, we risk a global collapse. Trump's eyes were intense, but there was something different in his expression now. The usual arrogance wasn't there. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "All right, so what do you want me to do? Smile and hand them all flowers?" Kamala's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a game, Donald. This is the future of humanity. You can't just throw your weight around and expect people to follow. You need to listen." Trump sat back, his posture defensive but thoughtful. "Fine, I'll listen. But I won't back down. And I sure as hell won't let anyone walk all over us. Let's see what we're working with." Kamala took a slow breath, feeling the tightness in her chest. The clock was ticking. The world was waiting for them to act. She knew she had to take charge. But the challenge of working with Trump, someone so diametrically opposed to her, was weighing on her. "All right then," Kamala said, her voice cold and calculated. "Let's start by setting the ground rules. No more threats, no more games. We're here to talk, to listen, and to find common ground. Otherwise, this summit is over before it even begins." Trump looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he nodded. "I'll play by your rules. For now." Kamala couldn't tell if that was progress or just another stall tactic, but she didn't have time to figure it out. There were too many lives at stake. "Good," she said, standing up. "Now let's make sure we don't waste any more time." As Kamala and Trump walked out of the conference room for a brief break, the weight of the summit seemed to follow them like a cloud. Kamala's mind raced with the looming uncertainty of what the next few hours would bring. Every moment felt like a choice between peace and catastrophe. Trump said, his voice low as they made their way down the corridor. "I think you're too soft on them. These guys don't want diplomacy. They want to see who blinks first." Kamala's brow furrowed. But, so she kept her tone even. "Trump, that's the problem. If we keep playing the who blinks first game, we're going to end up with a war. We can't afford to escalate things anymore. People are dying. Whole cities are at risk." Trump stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. There was an edge to his voice now, one that Kamala knew too well. "And you think I don't know that? You think I'm blind to the consequences?" Kamala met his gaze. There was anger in his eyes, but there was also something else, something that was harder to define. He was scared. "No, but I think you're willing to let the whole world burn just to prove a point." He let out a sharp laugh. "You really believe that?" "I'm doing this to save the world, Kamala. If that means shaking things up, so be it." Kamala shook her head, her voice softening, though her frustration was still palpable. "Sometimes shaking things up just makes the situation worse. You've got to listen. Listen to what they need, what they're afraid of. If we don't, this whole summit is a waste of time." They stood there for a long moment, the quiet tension between them almost suffocating. Kamala's mind was a whirlwind of doubts and plans, but she couldn't lose her focus. This wasn't just about winning an argument with Trump. It was about finding a way to stop a war. Trump sighed and rubbed his temple. "I get it, Kamala. I do. But you don't have the luxury of being too nice with them. These are world leaders who won't give an inch unless you make them. Trust me, I've been there." Kamala studied him, her eyes narrowing. "And how did that work out for you?" Trump's lips tightened into a thin line. "It worked out fine. In the end, you have to have a backbone." Kamala could feel the conversation going in circles. "Having a backbone isn't about being stubborn, Donald. It's about understanding the stakes. What's the point of winning a battle if you lose everything else in the process?" Before Trump could respond, the doors to the room opened again, and Ivanov stepped through us, his expression unreadable. "Are we ready to continue?" he asked, his tone cold. Kamala shot Trump a quick look, silently reminding him that the time for arguing was over. She nodded, pushing her frustration aside for the moment. "Yes. Let's get back to it." inside the conference room. The tension in the room had only grown stronger after the brief break. Kamala and Trump took their seats at the table, and the others followed suit. The weight of the negotiations hung heavy in the air as everyone awaited the next move. "We're at a crossroads," Kamala said, her voice carrying authority now. "We can either work together, find a way to lower tensions, or we can watch this spiral into something catastrophic. The choice is ours." Ivanov leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Madam Vice President?" Kamala took a deep breath, looking around the room at the leaders. "I'm suggesting that we all take a step back. I understand that everyone here is concerned about their national security, but we're not going to resolve anything if we keep threatening each other." Trump leaned in, his voice carrying a sharpness that caught everyone's attention. "I don't know about you, Ivanov, but we can't just sit here and play nice. Your country's been testing missiles, your allies are building alliances against us, and you expect us to just back off." Ivanov's gaze flickered to Trump, his expression hardening. "You think we're afraid of your threats, Mr. Trump? You want to prove who's stronger? I've seen your administration crumble from the inside out. I'm not impressed." Kamala could feel the animosity rising, and she quickly interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Enough. This isn't helping." She turned to Ivanov. "What will it take for us to begin dismantling the warheads? You've said you're willing to consider a ceasefire, but we need a concrete plan." Ivanov's lips curled into a sneer. "You want a plan? Fine. But there's one condition. The U.S. needs to lift its sanctions immediately. That's the only way forward." Kamala's eyes widened. "Lifting sanctions? You know as well as I do that this isn't just about trade. This is about security, about trust, and I can't simply remove sanctions without the proper assurances." Trump's voice broke in again, this time with more heat. "The sanctions are leverage, Kamala. If we take them off the table, we've got nothing. You can't give in to every demand." Kamala's patience was thinning. "I'm not giving in, but I'm not going to let your ego ruin this either." There was a long pause as Kamala and Trump locked eyes. The others in the room waited, sensing that the next few minutes could decide everything. Finally, Kamala spoke again, her voice low but resolute. "Let's take a step back. We'll look at the sanctions issue, but we'll also hold firm on our own security concerns. We need a way forward that includes guarantees for both sides, and above all, we need a stop to the missile testing. That's non-negotiable." Ivanov regarded her with a calculating look, then glanced at Trump. "Very well, but we'll need to consult with our allies before anything is finalized." Kamala nodded, a small sense of victory blooming inside her. "That's all we can ask for right now. We'll continue the talks tomorrow." Trump looked less than satisfied, but he didn't argue. He stood up and Kamala followed suit. As they made their way out of the room, the weight of the moment pressed down on them. "So you think we made progress?" Trump asked, his voice still tinged with skepticism. Kamala glanced at him, her expression serious. "I think we did, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Trump gave a tight smile, though his eyes were still wary. "I hope you're right, because if we don't get it right, there won't be a world left to argue over." Kamala nodded, knowing that the next few days would be crucial. "I know, but we'll fight for it. Together." Trump hesitated before responding, almost like he was weighing his words. "Together. I'll give you that. For now." The days following the initial talks were filled with long hours, terse conversations, and mounting pressure. The world's fate hung in the balance, and Kamala could feel the weight of it on her shoulders every minute. Every word spoken, every concession made, had the potential to tip the scale either toward peace or catastrophe. She sat across from Trump in a quiet corner of the conference hall, both of them sipping cold coffee, their minds far from the caffeine they were consuming. The sound of muffled voices echoed from the other side of the room as the other leaders continued their discussions. Kamala rubbed her temples, her exhaustion showing, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. "We're running out of time. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Trump, who had been staring at a stack of papers in front of him, finally looked up. His expression was hard as usual, but Kamala noticed a trace of weariness in his eyes too. "Now you think I don't notice that? These guys don't get it, Kamala. Every time we make progress, one of them pulls something that sets us back." Kamala leaned forward, her voice tinged with frustration. "I know, but we can't throw out there say sin throw to row and alasu. I'll put you got a ninja. Beware mas in the say I said is silver t-shirt. You like Kaisha, yeah, to bet you see you. Been in these talks before. You've seen how this works." Trump let out a small chuckle, but it wasn't the kind of laugh Kamala had expected. There was no humor in it. "Trust me, I've been in these rooms enough times to know the only language that works with them is strength. They don't respect you if you're nice to them. You've got to show them you mean business." Kamala took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "I'm not asking you to be nice, Donald. I'm asking you to think beyond what's easy. If we keep going this route, we risk everything." Trump's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "I get it, Kamala. You're trying to play the diplomat. But some of these countries don't care about diplomacy. They care about power. And if we don't give them a reason to back down, we're done." Kamala's chest tightened, her pulse quickening. "I don't think you understand the stakes here. This isn't a business deal. This is real life. We're talking about the survival of millions of people." Trump's gaze softened slightly, but there was still an edge in his eye. "And I'm trying to make sure those millions of people don't end up in a war. But you can't fight fire with water, Kamala. Sometimes you've got to use fire to stop it." Kamala closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself. "And what if we just end up burning the whole world down?" There was silence between them for a few seconds. Kamala could feel the weight of their differences. She couldn't deny the truth in what he was saying, but at the same time, her fear was growing. The more they pushed, the more the other leaders seemed to dig their heels in. She had to find a way to make them see reason. "We've got one shot at this," Kamala said, breaking the silence. "We need something that will force them to the table without triggering a full-scale war." Trump leaned back, his arms crossed as he thought. What about a no-fly zone? It would limit their military capabilities, and it's something they can't ignore. Kamala mulled it over, tapping her fingers against the table. A no-fly zone could work, but it might push them into desperation. We'd need to pair it with something else, something that shows we're not out to destroy them, just to protect ourselves. Trump raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Kamala's mind raced, thinking of all the ways they could shift the balance. She couldn't afford to make a misstep, not now. "What if we offered a phased reduction in military spending for both sides, a joint arms reduction deal, but with strict monitoring to ensure compliance?" Trump stared at her for a long moment, the skepticism in his eyes still present, but there was a flicker of something else. Perhaps it was hope. "That's a big ask. You think they'd go for it?" Kamala nodded. "It's a risk, but it's better than nothing. If we can show that we're willing to make concessions for peace, maybe they'll follow suit. And if not, we keep the pressure on with stronger sanctions." Trump thought it over. He wasn't sold, but there was a slight change in his demeanor. "I'll admit it's a better option than I thought. But how do we sell this to the others? They're not going to be happy with the idea of us backing down." Kamala stood, pacing for a moment, her mind churning with options. "We don't back down. We show them we're trying to create a path to peace, but we're also willing to defend ourselves. And if they want to continue escalating, we'll do what we have to do." Trump stood up too, the weight of the moment settling on him. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? Some of these leaders are not going to take kindly to the idea of the U.S. compromising. Kamala looked at him, her eyes meeting his with determination. I know, but we have to try. We don't have any other choice. Trump gave a reluctant nod. All right, let's do it. But I'm telling you, Kamala, we need to make them understand we're not playing games. Kamala gave a firm nod back. Agreed. Later that evening, Kamala and Trump joined the other leaders in the main conference room. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone could sense that the end of the summit was drawing near, and the urgency was palpable. Kamala and Trump presented their proposal, a phased military reduction plan paired with a no-fly zone and strong monitoring systems. As the leaders listened, Kamala couldn't help but notice how the room seemed to hold its breath. Ivanov was the first to speak. So you think you can just force us into compliance? He sneered. We don't take orders from the United States. Trump stepped forward, his voice rising. This isn't about orders, Ivanov. It's about survival. You want to keep testing missiles and threatening the world. You'll find out that the US is ready to protect itself. But we're also offering a way out. A way to end this. Without bloodshed, Kamala added, her voice calm but unwavering. This is a chance for us all to reduce the risk of war. We've done this before in history, and we can do it again. But it requires trust, from all sides. There was a long pause. Kamala's heart raced as she watched the reactions around the room. This was the moment. Finally, Joe, the Chinese representative, spoke. We will consider your offer. But know this, Kamala and Trump, this is not a game. If we find that you are deceiving us or not holding up your end of the bargain, there will be consequences. Kamala nodded solemnly, her voice steady. We understand. But we're committed to peace, and we'll hold up our end. If you do, you the same. As the leaders began to discuss the terms, Kamala exchanged a brief glance with Trump. Their work was far from over, but for the first time since the summit began, there was a glimmer of hope, a tiny flicker of possibility. We might just have a shot, Kamala muttered under her breath, but we have to keep pushing. Trump, for the first time in days, gave a faint smile. I'll push, and I'll make them listen. The clock was ticking down. After days of grueling talks, the leaders in the room had reached an impasse. Kamala could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, as Ivanov, Joe, and the others argued over every minute detail of the proposed military reductions. Their voices, heated and growing louder, echoed off the walls of the sterile conference room. Kamala exchanged a quick look with Trump, who had been unusually quiet during the last few hours of negotiation. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting back and forth between the other leaders. Kamala leaned over to him, her voice barely above a whisper. We're losing them, Donald. The more we try to compromise, the less they trust us. Trump shot her a look, his frustration evident. They're playing games, Kamala. This is what they do. Drag it out until they've squeezed everything out of us. Kamala's mind raced. She knew Trump wasn't wrong, but there had to be a way to make them see reason. We can't walk away, empty-handed. We can't give them any more excuses to escalate. We need a solution. Trump's eyes darkened, his hands balled into fists on the table. I've tried it your way, playing the diplomat, offering compromises. It's not working. I say we start putting the pressure on them, show them who's really in charge here. Kamala shook her head, her voice firm. If we push too hard, we risk everything. This isn't just about power, Donald. It's about saving lives. You want to play hardball? Fine, but we can't afford to gamble with peace. The room around them grew louder, the debate escalating into a shouting match. Kamala could feel her heart pounding. This was it. This was the breaking point. We're not going to get anywhere if we don't start making some serious decisions, Ivanov snapped, his face red with anger. This is a waste of time. Kamala stood up, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. We don't have time for this, she turned toward Ivanov. We're not going to resolve anything by shouting at each other. You've said you're open to peace, but now it's time to prove it. We need a real commitment from every side, or we walk out of here without a deal. Ivanov glared at her, his fists clenched. You think you can just make demands? You're overplaying your hand, Madam Vice President. Trump stood up next to Kamala, his presence commanding, his voice booming. You're damn right we're making demands, Ivanov. This is bigger than your ego. You want peace? You'll have to earn it. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension so thick that it seemed to suffocate the air. Kamala's pulse was racing as she looked around the room. Everyone was waiting for the next move, and she could feel the eyes of the world on them. Kamala turned back to Trump, her voice low. This is it, Donald. If we push too hard, we might lose them. But if we back off now, we lose everything. Trump looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, let's try one more time. But if they don't come to the table with something real, we go in hard. Kamala exhaled sharply, her anxiety ebbing just a little. She knew they were both walking a fine line, but this might be their last chance to secure peace. I agree, but we'll have to move quickly. No more playing around. Trump stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the room. This is the final offer. We're giving you one last chance to take this seriously. We're offering a phased reduction in military presence and a no-fly zone, but you need to agree to the terms today. No more delays. Ivanov narrowed his eyes, his voice dripping with suspicion. You think we'll just accept your terms? Trump leaned in, his voice quiet but laced with authority. Accept them or face the consequences. This is your choice. The U.S. won't sit back and let you play games with our security. The room was silent again. Kamala could feel the tension rising, her stomach turning with anxiety. This was the moment of truth. Then, unexpectedly, Joe spoke up. His voice was calm but filled with a sense of finality. We're willing to agree to some of the terms, but not all. The sanctions must remain in place until we see compliance. Kamala's eyes narrowed. You're asking for more than we're willing to give. We've already made significant concessions. If you want to move forward, we need real action, not just words. Joe's gaze flickered toward Ivanov, and Kamala could see the unspoken communication between them. She held her breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, Ivanov spoke, his voice laced with irritation. We'll agree to the terms, but under one condition. The sanctions are lifted in stages. We will not accept a full removal unless we see progress. Kamala took a deep breath, weighing the offer. That's not enough. We need more than just promises. If you want a deal, you need to prove it. Trump turned to her, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Kamala, we can't keep giving them everything. We have to hold our ground. Kamala shook her head, her voice steady but firm. We can't hold out forever, Donald. We'll have to find a middle ground. We'll accept a staged removal, but only if the monitoring systems are fully in place and we get clear milestones for compliance. Ivanov and Joe exchanged a quick look before nodding reluctantly. Agreed, Ivanov said. But if we don't see progress, the deal is off. Kamala nodded. We understand, but this is the best we're going to get. Trump, still clearly dissatisfied, grumbled under his breath, but didn't argue. Fine. Let's get this over. With. After the session ended, Kamala and Trump retreated to the U.S. Embassy for a debrief. The deal was in place, but it felt fragile, too fragile to be trusted fully. Kamala could feel the exhaustion settling in as she sat down at the table, reviewing the final terms. Trump took a seat across from her, his expression unreadable. That was too close, Kamala. We barely got through that. Kamala sighed, her hand pressed to her forehead. It's not over. We have to stay vigilant. We have a deal, but the hard part starts now. We need to make sure they follow through. Trump's lips twisted into a grim smile. You've got that right. But I'll be damned if we let them back out now. I'll make sure they don't get away with it. Kamala nodded, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. We'll make sure of it. Together. There was a long silence, and for the first time in days, Kamala felt like there were an attention. Sighed. It wasn't perfect, but they had a plan. The tension wasn't gone, but it had shifted. For the first time there was hope, a fragile, uncertain hope, but hope nonetheless. It had been 2 weeks since the agreement was signed. Kamala stood in the Oval Office, staring out of the large windows at the sprawling lawn outside. The weight of the world seemed to be hanging over her once again. They had made a deal, but the real test was just beginning. The political and military leaders who had signed the accord had their own agendas, and she knew there were still factions out there who would do anything to sabotage the fragile peace they had achieved. Kamala wasn't alone. Trump stood beside her, both of them silent for a moment as they watched the early morning sunlight streaming over the White House grounds. The calm was deceptive. She could feel the tension creeping back into her muscles, the gnawing uncertainty that had been her constant companion these past few weeks. "We did it," Trump said, breaking the silence, his voice unusually soft. There was no bravado in it, just the quiet recognition of what they had pulled off. Kamala turned toward him, her face serious. "It's not over yet. We have to make sure the terms are implemented. The sanctions are still in place, and we need the monitoring systems to be effective. If we don't follow through, everything we've worked for could fall apart." Trump nodded slowly, his eyes hardening. "I know. That's why I'm not taking my eyes off this. I'm keeping tabs on every move they make." Kamala raised an eyebrow, not entirely convinced. "I don't want to hear about more threats, Donald. We need action, not posturing." Trump's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not posturing. I'm making sure they don't back out. You might play nice, Kamala, but I know how to get things done when the stakes are high." Kamala's patience was wearing thin. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I get it. But let's be clear. This is not a game. We have to work together on this, or it will all fall apart. We can't afford to go back to square one." Trump studied her for a moment as if weighing her words. Then he let out a long sigh. "You're right. We're in this together. No more games." Kamala nodded, appreciating the shift in his tone. "Good. Let's keep it that way. We need to have regular updates. The moment we see any red flags, we act fast." "Agreed." Trump gave her a sharp look. "But you know, Kamala, this is going to test us. We've made a lot of enemies in the last few weeks." Kamala's expression hardened. "I know. But we're not backing down. Not now." A few days later, Kamala and Trump were in a secure meeting room at the Pentagon. The air was thick with tension as top military advisors briefed them on the progress of the agreement's implementation. The satellite images and intelligence reports painted a grim picture. There were signs that some of the enemy factions were already looking for ways to circumvent the deal. Kamala felt her stomach drop as she scanned the reports. These missile sites in North Korea, they haven't been dismantled. Why weren't we informed sooner? One of the military advisors, General Carter, looked uncomfortable. "There were delays, Madam Vice President. We're monitoring the situation closely, but the progress has been slower than anticipated." Trump's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Slower? We agreed on a timeline. You should have acted sooner. I told you this was going to happen. They're testing us." Kamala glanced at Trump, her expression tight. "I know you're frustrated, Donald, but yelling isn't going to solve this. We need a solution, not an accusation." Trump ignored her, focusing instead on General Carter. Get your act together, Carter. If we don't see results, I'm putting more pressure on the situation. We don't have the luxury of time. General Carter stiffened but nodded. Yes, sir. We'll expedite the process. Kamala took a step forward, her voice steady but firm. We need to consider every angle. If they're stalling, it means they're testing the waters. We need to be ready for anything. Trump shot her a glance, then nodded. I agree. But I'll be damned if we let them walk all over us. Kamala was about to respond when her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and felt a wave of dread wash over her. It was a message from the UN Secretary-General. We have reports of a potential nuclear test in the coming days. The UN is calling for an emergency session. Kamala's breath caught in her throat. This is it, she muttered. If they go through with this, it'll break everything. We need to act now. Trump stood up abruptly, his face hardening with a resolve. Let's go. We'll make sure this doesn't get out of hand. A few hours later, Kamala and Trump were on a plane to New York, heading to the UN for an emergency session. The tension in the air was palpable. The news had spread fast. A nuclear test was imminent, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Kamala could feel her heart pounding as they entered the UN Security Council chamber. The room was filled with representatives from countries all over the world, their faces a mixture of concern and anger. As Kamala and Trump entered, all eyes turned to them. Kamala could sense the weight of their gazes, the expectations, the doubts. Everyone was waiting for them to lead. Kamala stood at the podium first, her voice steady but filled with urgency. We are facing a crisis. The situation in North Korea, if left unchecked, will escalate into a global disaster. We cannot let this go any further. The agreement we signed is our last chance at peace. Trump stepped forward, his tone commanding. You all know what's at stake here. We're not going to let anyone violate this agreement. The U.S. will take immediate action if necessary, but we also expect every country here to hold their ground. We're not doing this alone. The room erupted into heated debate. Several representatives voiced their concerns, questioning the effectiveness of the deal and accusing the U.S. of not doing enough to hold up its end. Kamala and Trump listened carefully, exchanging glances, both realizing that their unity was the only thing that could push this through. Kamala stepped back to the podium, her voice rising above the noise. This is not just about one country. This is about all of us. If we allow one nation to break this deal, we send the message that it's okay to threaten the world with weapons of mass destruction. That cannot happen. Trump nodded in agreement. And if they don't listen, we'll make them listen. We're not backing down. The room fell into a tense silence. Kamala's heart raced, but she held her ground. This was the moment they had both been working for. The world was watching, and their next move would decide Avani. As the UN session broke up, Kamala and Trump stood in the hallway outside, the weight of the world still hanging over them. Kamala couldn't help but feel the shift in their dynamic. The past weeks had been filled with tension and conflict, but in this moment there was something different. Trump turned to her, his expression softening. You did good in there, real good. Kamala looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Thanks. But this isn't over. We still have a long road ahead. Trump gave a small, approving nod. I know, but at least we're in this together. You've got my back, and I've got yours. Kamala nodded, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. Let's make sure we finish what we started. Trump extended his hand. Kamala hesitated for just a second before shaking it. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a sign of trust. It was a recognition that they had come a long way, and they still had a long way to go. But together, they might just be able to save the world. It had only been a few days since the UN session, but the peace deal was already starting to fray at the edges. Kamala sat at her desk in the Vice President's office, reviewing a series of reports that had come in over the last few hours. Satellite images, intelligence briefs, audio intercepts, all pointing to one thing. Someone, somewhere, was preparing to take advantage of the growing cracks in the agreement. Kamala's head ached as she skimmed through the documents. "It's happening," she muttered under her breath. "We knew they would try to undermine us." She pressed a button on her desk, connecting to Trump's private line. The phone rang for a few seconds before his voice picked up, sharp and direct. "Kamala, what's going on, Trump?" Kamala wasted no time. "We've got trouble. There's a coordinated cyber attack happening, targeting key military installations and communications across the globe. They're trying to destabilize the agreement. I need you to get to the White House right now." Trump's tone hardened. "Understood. I'll be there in 15. Don't do anything without me." Kamala felt a wave of anxiety, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to let the pressure crack her resolve now. "I'll be waiting." Kamala paced the Oval Office, her mind racing. The attack was sophisticated, well coordinated, with multiple countries and factions involved. It was as if someone had been waiting for the moment of weakness. The question was who? Trump arrived a few minutes later, his usual bravado replaced by an unmistakable urgency. His eyes locked with Kamala's, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What's the status?" he demanded. Kamala handed him a tablet showing the latest reports. "We've identified multiple compromised military systems in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. Communications are down in several key regions, and we've lost satellite tracking in parts of North Korea and Russia. Whoever's behind this has planned it well." Trump frowned, scanning the data. "It's a damn mess. Who do we think is pulling the strings?" Kamala shook her head. "Right now, it could be anyone. We're looking at both state and non-state actors, rogue groups, possibly even a coordinated attack by rival nations who want to see this deal fail." "I'm not letting this slide," Trump growled. "We'll make them pay. Get me the head of cyber operations." Kamala placed a call to General Carter, who had been instrumental in managing the military's response to the crisis. He arrived within minutes, his face grim. "Madame Vice President, Mr. President," Carter began, taking a seat at the table. "We've managed to contain the attacks on several fronts, but we're still in the dark on who's behind it. The level of sophistication is beyond anything we've seen before." Kamala looked at Trump, who was already fidgeting with his phone, firing off texts. "We need answers now," she said. "If we don't find the source, we risk losing everything we've worked for." "We're working on it, but it's not going to be fast," Carter replied. "We may need to consider military action if it turns into something bigger." Trump's eyes narrowed. "Military action? That's exactly what they want. They want to provoke us into doing something stupid." Kamala sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I know. We have to stay calm. But time is running out, and we're already starting to see cracks in the coalition. If we act recklessly, it'll all fall apart." Hours passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and updates. The situation was worsening by the minute, with new attacks emerging on multiple fronts. Kamala and Trump had been in constant contact with world leaders, trying to keep the situation under control. But the pressure was mounting, and there was no easy solution. "I can't keep doing this," Kamala said suddenly, her voice strained. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered lawn. The silence outside was a stark contrast to the chaos within. Trump followed her, his expression softening for the first time in hours. "You're doing everything you can, Kamala. I know this isn't easy. Hell, it's a damn nightmare." Kamala's frustration boiled over. It's more than that, Donald. We've got people attacking us from every angle. They're trying to make us crumble, and I'm scared we're not going to be able to hold it together. Trump stood beside her, his voice quieter. Look, I get it. I know it's hard, but we're not backing down. You and me, we've been through worse, right? Kamala met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his eyes. I just don't know anymore. Trump's expression hardened again. Then we need to figure it out. Fast. I won't let these bastards win. We can beat them, Kamala. We just have to stay one step ahead. Kamala let out a deep breath, the tension in her body slowly starting to ease. All right, but this time we do it carefully. We can't afford to make any mistakes. The next few days were a blur. Kamala and Trump worked around the clock, overseeing the investigation into the cyber attacks. General Carter and his team identified the source of the attacks, a network of rogue operatives working in conjunction with a few well-placed officials from rival nations. Kamala could feel her nerves fraying with each passing hour. But then as they sifted through the intelligence, something clicked. The operatives had been using a series of covert communications channels that led back to a single location, a small but powerful faction in Eastern Europe with ties to North Korea. Kamala and Trump exchanged a look. I think we have them, she said, a sense of determination rising in her chest. We need to act now before they get any further. Trump was already on the phone, giving orders. Get me the military. We're going to shut them down before they have a chance to do more damage. Kamala leaned in, her focus razor sharp. We'll do it, but we have to be smart. We can't risk escalating this further. Trump nodded, his eyes locked on hers. We'll do it your way. But we're not backing down, Kamala. This ends now. Kamala and Trump's plan went into action swiftly. Using a combination of diplomatic pressure and covert military operations, they managed to cripple the rogue faction before they could launch a full-scale attack. The enemy's communications were cut off, and within hours, the threat had been neutralized. Back at the White House, Kamala allowed herself a moment of relief. The immediate danger was over. But she knew it wasn't the end. The fragile peace they had worked so hard to secure was still on the line. Trump walked into the room, his expression unreadable. He took a seat across from Kamala, the exhaustion from the past few days written on his face. We did it, Kamala. We stopped them. Kamala leaned back in her chair, her hands pressed together in front of her. We did. But this is just the beginning. We can't let our guard down now. Trump nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. I know, but we're still standing. And we're going to make sure we stay that way. Kamala looked at him, her thoughts running deep. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about trust. It was about a partnership that had been forged under fire and had survived the worst. We'll stay standing. Together. The days that followed the cyber attack were filled with fleeting moments of calm before the next storm hit. Kamala sat alone in the vice president's office, staring at a map of the world pinned to the wall. She traced her fingers over various hotspots, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, South Asia, all places where peace was fragile, easily shattered. Even the smallest spark could set everything ablaze again. Kamala knew that maintaining peace was more complicated than making deals in a conference room. This was real life, where every decision had dire consequences. Every word she said, every promise made, carried weight. She couldn't afford to fail. Not now. The door creaked open, and Trump walked in. The tension between them had shifted in recent weeks. No longer just political opponents, they were partners, fighting the same battle, for better or for worse. Kamala, we have a problem, Trump said, his voice unusually serious. His usually confident, booming tone was subdued. And Kamala immediately felt the gravity of the moment. She looked up, not needing to ask what the problem was. What is it now? Trump tossed a folder onto her desk. We've received intel from multiple sources. There's a new faction, an alliance of extremists and military officials. that's been planning something bigger, something that could blow the peace deal to pieces. They've got support from rogue states and they're ready to take action. Kamala took the folder and began scanning the details. Her mind raced. They're serious. They're preparing to strike in the next few days, targeting key peacekeeping operations. If they succeed, they'll unravel everything. Trump slammed his fist onto the desk, anger flashing in his eyes. I won't let that happen. We're not backing down. Kamala stood up, walking over to the window to think. I know you won't, but we need to be smarter than them. If we act too rashly, we could push the entire region into chaos. Trump crossed the room to join her, his voice quieter now. We've been pushed to the brink too many times, Kamala. They've attacked us. They've made their move and they'll keep coming. We need to hit them before they hit us. Kamala turned toward him, meeting his eyes. And we need to do it without starting a war. The world is watching us. If we escalate things, if we overreact, we could lose everything. Trump's jaw tightened. So what do we do? Just sit back and wait for them to attack? Kamala shook her head. We fight back, but we fight smart. We outmaneuver them, stay one step ahead. But we can't let our emotions control the situation. We've worked too hard to let it all fall apart now. Trump nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way, or we don't do it at all. Kamala raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. That's what I'm afraid of. Over the next 48 hours, Kamala and Trump threw everything they had into preventing a catastrophic escalation. Every military asset was mobilized, every diplomatic channel was opened, but the enemy was elusive. They knew someone was orchestrating the attacks. But who? Kamala and Trump spent sleepless nights in war rooms, reviewing strategies, running through simulations, and speaking with military leaders from around the world. The pressure weighed heavily on both of them, but they never wavered. Each move had to be calculated, each decision a risk. It was a game of patience, a game of nerves. But for the first time since they had started this mission together, Kamala could feel a new dynamic emerging between her and Trump. There was a quiet understanding, a trust built from the fire of shared experience. They weren't just working together, they were relying on each other, pushing each other to stay sharp, stay focused. On the third night, as they sat in the White House Situation Room, Kamala looked at Trump, her eyes tired but resolute. We're almost there, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. We've identified the key players. We just need to move fast. Trump nodded, tapping his fingers on the table. We have one shot at this. If we hit them now, we might just catch them off guard. Kamala stood up. Then it's time. At 3 a.m. Die feint event assassinated. Preemptive strike was launched against the rogue factions responsible for the attacks, using a mix of cyber warfare, covert military operations, and diplomatic pressure to cripple their operations. Kamala and Trump had both agreed that the strike had to be swift and precise, no room for mistakes. As the mission unfolded, Kamala monitored the situation from the Oval Office, her heart pounding with every update. Her hand hovered over the phone, ready to make the call if things went wrong. Trump stood beside her, a silent presence as they waited for the first signs of success or failure. Hours passed, and the tension in the room was unbearable. The reports trickled in slowly. They had hit the enemy hard, but there were still reports of isolated resistance from rogue factions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Kamala clenched her fists, silently willing the operation to succeed. They're not giving up, Trump muttered, watching the screen closely. But we've got them on the run. This is it, Kamala. We've got them right where we want them. Kamala's eyes narrowed as she observed the progress. Stay focused. We can't afford to lose our footing now. We need to see this through. The next few hours felt like days, but when the final reports came in, Kamala finally allowed herself a moment of relief. The operation had worked. The rogue factions had been neutralized and the majority of their leadership had been taken into custody. The peace deal was still intact. Kamala slumped back in her chair, exhausted but relieved. "We did it," she whispered more to herself than anyone else in the room. Trump exhaled sharply, his posture relaxing for the first time in days. "Yeah, we did. And we're going to keep doing it, Kamala. We're not done yet." Kamala turned toward him, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. "Number, but for now, we've won." As the dust settled, Kamala and Trump spent the following weeks working to secure the peace deal and rebuild the fractured alliances. The threat of war had passed, but the scars from the conflict would take time to heal. The bond between them had deepened, their mutual respect now evident. They had faced an almost insurmountable challenge, but together, they had managed to hold the world's future together. Kamala stood on the steps of the White House, gazing out at the distant horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the country they had fought so hard to protect. She felt a sense of peace. But it was a peace tempered by the knowledge that the battle was never truly over. "We're going to keep this going, right?" Trump's voice broke through her thoughts. Kamala turned to face him, her expression serious, but not without a hint of pride. "We will, as long as we remember what we're fighting for." Trump extended his hand and Kamala took it, a silent promise passing between them. They had done what they thought was impossible, and together they would continue to fight for peace. Kamala turned to him. "There are people questioning the path we've chosen. They want us to break the deal, abandon the progress we've made." Trump's jaw tightened. "I knew this was coming. They've been waiting for an excuse to turn on us." Kamala's voice softened but remained firm. "And we can't let them. If we break now, we'll lose everything we've worked for. We've come too far to turn back." Trump looked at her for a long moment, his eyes scanning the room. Finally he spoke. "Then we stand together. We fight for this, all the way." Kamala nodded. The weight of leadership never felt heavier than it did in that moment, but she knew Trump was right. If they didn't stand together, they would both fall apart. The following weeks were a test of their resilience. As tensions simmered both within the US and across the globe, Kamala and Trump continued to forge ahead. They took bold steps to strengthen international partnerships, stabilize fragile regions, and ensure the agreement remained intact. In the Middle East, where distrust ran deep, Kamala and Trump brokered an unprecedented deal between two longtime rivals. The negotiations were difficult, emotions ran high, and every concession felt like a personal defeat. But they persevered. "This is it," Trump said after the deal was signed, the weight of the moment settling in. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Kamala looked at him, a mix of exhaustion and pride in her eyes. "We did it. We actually did it." Trump smiled, but there was something more in his expression, a recognition of the long road they had traveled and the monumental effort it had taken to get here. The final months of their joint leadership were filled with a mix of triumph and uncertainty. The peace deal held, but the world was ever-changing, and Kamala and Trump knew they could never relax their guard. But they had come to see each other in a new light. What began as a reluctant partnership had transformed into a bond forged in the fire of global crisis. Their differences, while still present, no longer defined them. Kamala stood at the podium, one final time, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed the nation and the world. "This is a new dawn," she said, her words echoing in the hearts of those listening. "A new era of cooperation, trust, and peace. But this is only the beginning. We will continue to fight for a better future, for all of us." Trump stood beside her, his hand on the podium, his gaze unwavering. "We've proven that when we come together, when we trust each other, we can overcome any challenge, and we will continue to do just that." The applause was deafening, but it wasn't just for them. It was for the world they had saved. It was for the fragile peace that together they had built. After months of hard-fought negotiations and daring moves, Kamala and Trump had secured an unprecedented peace deal. The stability they had brought to the world had in many ways seemed miraculous. Diplomats and leaders were praising their courage, their willingness to work together despite their differences. The media hailed them as symbols of cooperation, the unexpected duo who saved the world from the brink of war. Yet there was something in the air that felt unsettled. Both Kamala and Trump could feel it. The world was no longer simply holding its breath. It was waiting for something more. The sun was setting over Washington, casting long shadows across the White House lawn. Kamala sat in her office, reviewing the last of the reports. Everything was on track. Peace talks were progressing in the Middle East. Alliances were growing stronger, and even domestic tensions seemed to be calming. But then the phone rang. Kamala's heart skipped a beat. It was an encrypted call. She looked at the number, not recognizing it. A small, sinking feeling crept over her. "Kamala," the voice on the other end of the line said, gravelly and urgent. "You need to listen closely. There's a threat, one unlike anything you've dealt with before." Kamala's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you have to act, and you have to act fast. Someone is planning to destabilize everything you've worked for. They've infiltrated your inner circle. The peace deal is under threat." Kamala's mind raced. She turned toward the window, her thoughts jumbled. "Who would do this?" The voice paused. "There's no time. You and Trump need to meet. You both are the only ones who can stop this. Trust no one but yourselves." Before Kamala could respond, the line went dead. Kamala stood frozen for a moment, the phone still in her hand. Her thoughts spun as she processed the warning. Someone within their administration was betraying them. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her closest advisors. Without hesitation, Kamala dialed Trump. His voice, as gruff as ever, came through immediately. "Kamala, what's going on? You sound off?" "I just got a call. Someone's planning to take down everything we've built. They've infiltrated our inner circle." Trump's tone shifted immediately. "Damn, who is it?" Kamala shook her head. "I don't know yet, but we need to meet. This is bigger than we thought." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Kamala could almost hear Trump's mind working, his instincts kicking in. "All right, let's do this. Where and when?" Kamala's hand shook as she pressed the button to hang up. She quickly scribbled down a time and place for their meeting. An untraceable location, far from the eyes of their enemies. This was it, the final test. Kamala and Trump arrived at the location just before midnight, an abandoned warehouse in a quiet part of the city. The place had been cleared of surveillance and any security risks. Only the two of them knew what was about to unfold. As they entered, a low voice greeted them in the dark. "I knew you'd come." From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Kamala's breath caught in her throat. The person who emerged was none other than David, her young aide, the one she had trusted, the one who had been at her side throughout the crisis. "David," Kamala whispered, stunned. "What's going on?" David's eyes were cold, hard. "You think you've won?" You've played the game too long. You're both puppets, and I'm cutting the strings." Trump stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You've been playing us this whole time?" David smiled grimly. "You have no idea how deep this goes. This peace deal, this victory, it was always meant to fail. I've been working with others who want to tear everything down. And now, the world will see that your so-called partnership was nothing but a fleeting illusion." Kamala's heart raced as the full weight of the betrayal hit her. David had been her closest confidant, the person she trusted most. And now he was the very person threatening everything she and Trump had worked for. "You're wrong," Kamala said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "This is bigger than just us. People are depending on the peace we've created. You can't destroy that." David's smile only grew colder. "I've already started. You'll see soon enough." Kamala and Trump exchanged a quick glance. Time was running out. If David had already set his plans in motion, they didn't have much time before chaos ensued. Without hesitation, Trump pulled out his phone and hit a number. "We need to stop this now." The plan was simple. Track down every source David had been working with. Dismantle the conspiracy before it had a chance to fully unfold, and ensure that the peace agreement remained intact. They had no other choice. This was the final test of their partnership. "David, you've made a grave mistake," Kamala said, her voice low but unwavering. "We're stopping you." David's face twisted with fury, but before he could react, Trump and Kamala launched their counter-offensive. They worked in perfect sync, their minds sharp, their movements swift. Each call they made was a calculated move in a high-stakes chess game. By the time the morning sun began to rise, the conspiracy had been unraveled. David, along with the other operatives working against them, had been taken into custody. The world would never know how close they had come to undoing everything. Kamala and Trump stood side by side, watching as the last of the conspirators were arrested. "We made it," Kamala said, quietly, her voice filled with exhaustion and relief. Trump nodded, his face grim. "We did. But I'll tell you something, Kamala. You're the only one I would have trusted to handle that. We couldn't have done this without each other." Kamala turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "I think we're finally done fighting the same battles. Maybe it's time to let the world see us as allies, genuine ones." Trump paused, then nodded again. "Maybe. But this time, when the world sees us, they'll know we weren't just allies by circumstance. We were allies because we chose to be, because we knew the cost of peace, and we were willing to pay it." As the first rays of light broke over the horizon, Kamala and Trump stood together, the weight of the world on their shoulders, but a quiet, shared understanding between them. They had saved the world, but in doing so, they had also changed the course of history. And now the world was theirs to rebuild, together. The world would always remember Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, not as adversaries, but as the leaders who fought side by side, defied expectations, and ultimately proved that peace was not just a dream, but a reality that could be shaped through courage, trust, and the will to do the impossible. And as they walked into the future, hand in hand, the world finally understood. The greatest victory was not in the peace they had won, but in the unlikely partnership that had made it all possible. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you want more stories like this, subscribe Storyboat.